Welcome to a special edition of BeerNet Radio, the podcast where all your dreams come true. Today we have our legal correspondent, Bianca Bruno, joining us today to talk about the trial of the century. Not really. I mean, just the trial of the year, I guess, between AB Inbev and Constellation. Of course, the jury sided with Constellation in that trial. And basically, under Constellation's sublicense agreement, which was signed, I guess, in like 2013, that their hard seltzer product are, in fact, beer and are included under the sublicense agreement. The jury decided that on the Ides of March, which, of course, we know to beware of. I'd like to just set the stage and first point out that it's a little bit of a Pyrrhic victory because Corona Seltzer is down like 50%. And Modelo Rranch water was tested in 2 states, and then they expanded the test to 2 states that have more cows than people. I don't know how much these guys spent on this trial, but it's been going on for a couple of years, so it's got to be probably 6-7 figures. You know, it sounded like even the judge was irritated. This is a huge, colossal waste of time. And the contract, first of all, I'm amazed that the contract didn't spell it out, because when ABI had to go through kind of a similar thing with Labatt in Canada, their sublicense agreement did clearly say malt-based products. Somehow that was left out of this sublicense agreement. And don't you know that ABI is looking back and saying, which attorneys drafted this and didn't include that? So Bianca, you were there in Manhattan at the trial. What were your major impressions? And did you see kind of the trial going one way or the other during the days that you were there?
As far as which attorneys drafted it, I mean, they were all pretty much witnesses, which I wrote about, that it was, such a technical trial because it was a trial of outside kind of big firm counsel questioning in-house corporate counsel, which is basically what the whole trial was.
I love that. Seeing attorneys bash on other attorneys. This is fun.
And then the judge bashed on them because they're attorneys and he can do that, and he knows what their antics are. So they weren't pulling any fast ones on the judge. But in terms of who seemed to have the better case, I mean, the judge obviously commented and we reported just how much he kind of was leaning into Constellation. And like, we were hoping when former ABI chief Carlos Brito was on the stand that we'd learned something new or interesting or trade secrecy. And we didn't, mainly because every time Constellation's attorney asked him a question, it was objected to, and the judge basically agreed to the objection. So they really could not get a word in. They couldn't ask him anything. And it went with that with him. It went with that with some other witnesses. And so in that sense, I guess it's hard to kind of understand in terms of witness testimony, what the jury would have considered in terms of swaying the case for Constellation, because Constellation just really couldn't get a word in.
And they ended up winning.
They ended up winning, yeah.
Because, from what I read from your coverage, it seemed like the judge was clearly on ABI's side. Like you said, they didn't allow Brito really to testify. They waived attorney-client privilege. Mm-hmm. And the Constellation's own attorney at the time said he didn't think that this was kosher. Did the verdict surprise you?
I think it surprised all of us. Yeah. Especially just because of how confident ABI seemed. So I guess, and I did ask like some of our sources if they talked to jurors after the verdict is read, because at that point jurors are allowed to talk to whoever they want to about the case. Someone involved with the case said that they thought that they had talked to the jurors, but that and this is a very attorney thing to say, they didn't really necessarily take what jurors have to say with a lot of consideration. So we don't really know what jurors were thinking and coming up with that verdict, but it kind of makes you think that maybe it just came down to the contract and the contract definition, especially because they only deliberated for an hour.
Wow.
I'm It's about, because there were two lawyers on the jury, right? And one was like a copyright attorney or a patent law attorney or something.
Yeah,
like that,
I mean, they were like an IP attorney that would certainly know what they were doing.
Right. So it's almost like, to me, I'm thinking like, well, everybody must have looked at him and been like, well, what do you think, buddy? And then they're like, all right, let's go. Let's get out of here. Right. So did you look at the jury? I mean, were you like eyeing up the jury's reaction during the trial?
I was, I don't know if it would be, if their reactions would be quite as telling, like in a criminal trial or something where there was like really explosive, weird testimony. But at one point, one guy did kind of look like he was dozing off.
I'm sure their eyes glazed over when they set the stage. I mean, forget all the beer and seltzer talk, but just to explain how Constellation has these brands in the U.S. and Anheuser-Busch has them everywhere else. And then you try to explain, well, so Constellation owns the brands in the U.S.? Well, kind of, no. They have the rights in perpetuity, but they're beholden to this agreement. And that alone, I think they probably just were like, okay, I have no idea.
Jordan, I don't understand it, and I've been in this business for how long, Jen? How long have I been in this?
30 years.
I forget.
Happy anniversary.
Did you not read my text I just sent you like 15 minutes ago? I just celebrated my 30-year anniversary in the business. I should have celebrated it last year, but I forgot. So,
but it's true though. Like you explain it, and then you think that Constellation owns the brands in the U.S. And you would think that they would have the right to do whatever they want with these brands.
That's
and
what
they can make their own
argued.
commercials. They can make Mexican style beers. They can do whatever they want, you think, but apparently not.
Well, they can't put spirits in it.
That was spelled out, Harry. I think spirits was the one thing that was spelled out in the
so let me touch on that for our listeners, because the sublicense agreement, the only really hard specifications is that it has to have yeast and no distilled spirits.
Yeah.
That was it. It didn't say malt. It didn't say sugar-based. And I think that was really the nail in the coffin for ABI, is that they didn't specify that it was malt-based. And yeast, I love that. I mean, all alcohol by definition has to have yeast. That's how it's made.
Well, apparently they discussed the yeast strains, and then there was a little bit of testimony in the trial that the contract was like, if one of the company's strains died, that they had to share their version, their strain. So like
ABI has to share.
Yeah, like if Modelo's, I'm getting confused. Just like
so ABI and Modelo are the same company.
Yeah.
Let's just be clear on that. And that's confusing to some people. So when we say Modelo, we mean Anheuser-Busch InBev, and then Constellation owns Modelo in the United States. Yeah, it's very confusing. I could just see the jury. You said they only took an hour after a 2-week trial, which is basically they basically had already decided. When you only take an hour, it takes an hour to write out the verdict on the forms. I mean,
I think everybody was ready to get out of there. It seems like.
They had it on Wednesday. The closing arguments were late Tuesday afternoon. So they kind of came in Wednesday morning and were like ready to go, which I knew they'd have a verdict before the weekend because no juries want to come back on Monday. So I was kind of thinking we'd get one Thursday or Friday, but they really were ready to get out of there.
If ABI appeals, and based on their statement, I bet you anything they do appeal, how long does that typically take?
From the time an appeal would be filed to the time the appellate panel, I think it's the Second Circuit in New York, the judge actually made a really fascinating comment about that at one point. He actually was, I think, admonishing Constellation, which he did a couple times, and they said, I had something to say. And he said, I'm sure you do. You can take it up with the Second Circuit. So I think it's the Second Circuit. I'm used to the Ninth Circuit, on the West Coast, but usually it takes a year. So by the time an appeal's filed to the time the judges are actually holding a hearing is about a year, except for like really consequential kind of appeals related to like governmental policies, but that's kind of a different ballgame.
Here's what I think about the appeal. The lawyers, of course, want the appeal because then they get paid more. So they're going to push ABI. I'm talking about ABI's attorneys. they'll push ABI to say, we got to appeal this. We have a clear win here. This was a one-off wacky jury. But if I were ABI, that's just even if they win, what do they win? I mean, Corona seltzers are not they're not a growing category anymore. Corona Seltzer has been a failure. I mean, there's no other way to say it. Sorry, Constellation, but I mean, they don't even have that much market share in the seltzer category.
I always thought it was about kind of Constellation digging their heels in and fighting this because they wanted to be able to innovate. And if you can't do a hard seltzer, can't do sugar-based versions, then there is no Beyond Beer extensions for these brands. And not that they really need them. I know the case centered on those two brands, but if ABI would have won, then I think that would have told Constellation, okay, well, then we're kind of stuck with what we got, and it has to be beer and nothing even kind of tiptoeing the lines outside of that.
Well, let me push back on you and steelman that, Jordan. All Constellation would have to do is just reformulate this shit and make it malt based, which they very well could do. I think the sugar base is just cheaper to make. I mean,
I will say, Harry, I don't know. I don't think actual testimony came out about it, but ABI basically alluded in like the way they asked a couple questions that the formula was originally malt based, but that it tasted bad. And there were like internal taste tests that were like, no, this is crap. And so they reformulated to be sugar based. So there were a couple like attorneys that kind of testified around that, but it wasn't like direct questioning, probably because in like a pretrial order, the judge said you can't ask that.
Interesting. Yeah. I say they can make it taste exactly the same. I know it's hard. It's hard to get that malty taste out of the, I mean, you know who can do that is Anthony Von Mandel.
Oh yeah.
It takes a lab coat, you know.
I'm pretty sure that's sugar.
They are, but before they went sugar based, their claim to fame was they could make a malt based taste, just as good as vodka, basically.
But Bianca, tell me about this Trump case this guy has to deal with now. That's why he was grumpy, you said.
I don't even know which one it is, but he's the judge on some trial related to Trump that's supposed to start soon.
I think it's an alleged criminal act from Trump. Yeah. And then I think he's also dealing with Harry's boy, Sam Bankman-Fried. So this guy has a lot on his plate.
God, no wonder he's grumpy.
Well, and we joked in leading up to the trial that this guy like had to have had it with this case because it was just filing after pulling this dictionary and this dictionary. And this guy was like, all right, I'm done. And then
because he told Constellation, he was like, there's a lot of paperwork and there is a point of diminishing returns on this shit. And you have way surpassed that. And not in this trial, but in any trials that I see covered by Netflix, drama trials, whatever, it always seems to me that attorneys do way overcomplicate. They've won their case and then they just overwin it and end up losing because they lose the jury. I don't know. I'm just talking out of my ass now.
Not really. You're talking as a regular person, which is, what it comes down to. They wanted to have a jury trial. They didn't arbitrate or whatever. So, yeah, that's who matters is like regular people who aren't technically trained, although two of the jurors were attorneys. So, they had a little more experience, which is unusual. I don't think I've ever seen a trial where they've had attorneys on the jury, let alone two. Usually those people are like immediately dismissed when they're selecting.
You've covered a lot of trials. When you think back about this particular trial, like what's the thing that will stand out to you? A moment.
I mean, probably when the judge like told them, like, whatever, take your case to the Second Circuit. Like, you all are you're gonna appeal this anyway. It's all like the spectacle of court is really fascinating, and I feel like it was more fascinating in this case than in other cases I've covered just because of how many attorneys were involved. And like, the litigating attorneys, the kind of outside counsel for both sides. I mean, there were at least 24 attorneys in the courtroom at a time.
Good Lord.
And then basically all the witnesses were their in-house counsel, where the judge would be like, you can't pull a fast one on me. They ask you a yes or no question. You have to answer yes or you have to answer no. You can't like explain, this whole background thing that's not allowed. And that because you're an attorney, stop litigating the case from the stand. I mean, he said that to multiple people. So, that whole spectacle is interesting because at the end of the day, it's like the jurors who are, tasked with making a decision, and they came up with a decision pretty quickly. Like Harry said, they were trying to complicate everything, and it maybe wasn't so complicated.
When this was first filed, my first reaction was, well, the government classifies it as beer, so it's beer. Right. Yeah. Did that come into play? Was that a big factor, you think?
Well, it did come into play a little bit when they questioned, and I think ABI probably had hoped it would be a lightning rod for them when they were questioning their Constellations associate general counsel. And so, all the witnesses have a pretrial deposition where they can show that in court via video. And so apparently when she had been questioned before the trial, she was the one who kind of wouldn't answer any questions related to that beer definition, and said it was attorney-client privilege. And so then ABI wanted to ask her about it during the trial, and they were, arguing about it before the judge to make their case. And the judge basically said, well, in the USPTO application that she filled out, she basically said Corona Hard Seltzer is not a beer. The judge said that, but then that was outside the presence of the jury. So when they were brought back in and then she was questioned more, I guess maybe they didn't drive that home, or the jury disagreed.
Huh.
So the definition thing is very convoluted because there's different definitions in different forms, and then the contract definition, and a lot of the attorneys who were called to testify were testifying about what was going on during these talks. The post DOJ complaint when in 2012. And so when they were writing the contract between ABI and Constellation in 2013, these attorneys were kind of talking about what their discussions were like. And it's like, well, that's fine, but the discussions weren't necessarily memorialized in the contract.
AB's gone to a lot of pains to say that Bud Light Seltzer is not a beer. And that's a marketing ploy because most of their consumers aren't drinking it because they think it's beer. Mm-hmm. Did that come into play at all in the trial?
I think they did want to show a can of Bud Light Seltzer at one point, but I want to say that the judge kind of shut down questioning about that.
When AB was going into so much detail of the definition, did it seem like Constellation was kind of doing the opposite and keeping things simple? Because I feel like most people only know 3 categories of alcohol, like beer, wine, spirits. Yeah. And if it's clearly not wine and there's no spirits in it, then it sits next to all these other beers.
Yeah.
I feel like you could kind of just convince people, well, then I don't know what it is, but I guess it's beer. And
everything's beer, Jordan. Everything's just
kind of what they did.
I mean, water's beer. It just hasn't been processed yet.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, if this trial says anything, it shows consumers don't really care about base or don't really know anything about it.
Don't know anything about it, yeah.
We all know, Jordan, that it's all about the base, the base, the base.
Is it base or bass?
If you're confused as a listener, then you're not 100-peer. 100-peer is 100%er. And 100%er is someone who listens to every podcast. Because back, I don't know, it was 2 or 3 podcasts ago, Jen famously asked Jordan Bass whether he pronounced his name Jordan Bass. So we don't know if they're going to appeal. It sounds like the judge just he wanted it off his table because he assumed there was going to be an appeal. And he has Sam Bankman-Fried and Donald Trump to contend with, which talk about a shit show on both those fronts. Whatever side you're on, you got to agree it's going to be a shit show. Sam Bankman-Fried is just, the more that comes out about that guy, the more it's just complete fraud. I kind of gave him the benefit of the doubt because he seems like such a nice guy and, just kind of a nerd, and maybe he was out of his league. And then more and more details keep coming out. And it's like, oh, yeah, It was full on premeditated fraud, and he knew exactly what was going on. This podcast is not about Sam Bankman-Fried, but sometimes I wish it was.
We would watch that show.
Yeah, we could just start it off with, you have a call from Rikers Island Penitentiary.
You have a collect call. I wish, Bianca, honestly, I wish this was filed in the Ninth Circuit Court, because that's a wacky court. You never know what's going to happen in that court. Thank you, Bianca's based in San Diego, so this was not an easy trip for her, but thank you for flying to Manhattan, sitting in, covering it for us day by day. It was interesting and fascinating to read, and I hope there is an appeal, just so we can send you back to Manhattan. And where did you stay?
I stayed in Chinatown.
See, that's good. I have trained my editors well. I stay at the Four Seasons.
Close, right?
The editors stay in Chinatown. Oh, that's great. Is everybody primed for a great weekend? Jordan, what are you doing?
Nothing. I'm taking it easy, man. I'm kind of like you. I've been all gunked up this week. I don't know if it's the pollen or what. So I'm probably going to take some NyQuil around 5 or 6 and
Hey, good luck, Leslie.
yeah, put Lenny down and then
maybe give Lenny a little NyQuil too.
She's been all messed up after daylight savings. So yeah,
they don't teach infants about the vagaries of daylight savings time. You know, I remember my grandfather, he would have automatic feeders in front of the house at his farm, and he would say, we got to adjust it because the deer don't know about daylight savings time. We have to adjust the timers. That is a very privileged anecdote. Bianca, what are you doing this weekend?
I'm gearing up. I'm going to Sacramento next week for the California Craft Beer Conference. So.
Oh, cool.
Bianca putting in the miles.
Yeah.
Putting in the miles. Jen, what are you up to?
Yeah, I'm taking the kids to the zoo.
Are you kidding?
Yes, I know, but the tree already fell, so.
For listeners at home, a tree fell yesterday at the San Antonio Zoo and injured several people, and I think one's critically injured.
Oh my God.
What a bizarre, it wasn't even windy or anything. I don't know what happened there.
I had no idea. I thought you were talking, I thought that was some sort of idiom, like I already told them we were doing it, so we got to go.
No.
A legitimate tree fell.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks guys for being on.
You didn't tell us what you were doing this week.
Oh yeah.
Oh yes. Absolutely nothing. Like Jordan, I'm still got a head cold or something, and allergies on top of that, and I'm just gonna NyQuil it up.
Well, you have all 3 of your sons in town.
Yeah, the toilets still aren't working in this joint. My 3 sons just came and destroyed the place and just left just a wave of destruction. I'm still dealing with it. I took a shower this morning. It's backing up into the shower. It's not worth having kids.
Let's be clear. His kids are grown-ass men now.
Well, that's part of the problem. All right. Well, that's about enough for us this week. We'll be back at you next week. We have another podcast coming with somebody.
Just Beer Alliance. We got a scintillating lineup, y'all. Stay tuned.
Okay. All right, guys. Take care. Have a good weekend.
See ya.
Bye, Harry.